Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Distil-Nation NZ podcast. My name is Tom. I'm the owner and distiller of Herrick Distillery. And I don't want to say it. But I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, Cameroon.
Oh, yeah, that's a new take. I'll take that.
Cameron, sorry.
No. I'm excited. I'm getting a wee bit worked up.
Oh.
You might even say I'm feeling a wee bit historical.
Oh, no. Get out of here. Podcast cancelled, everyone. Turn it off now.
No, well, what? So.
You're dead, yeah.
Oh, I so am. I mean, this was a topic that we had on the books for a while, but it's fair to say that when we did Rum 101 and we started to explore the history and the production of rum, we got really good response from that.
Yeah, well, yeah, people were interested in it, yeah.
And so we then decided that, okay, well, actually, we need to turn and face the history of mainly whiskey, because the early history of spirits in New Zealand is whiskey, for reasons that we're going to go into. But yeah, that early history of whiskey and spirits in New Zealand.
And I think it's maybe a good idea to just go over what's the accepted monologue, the accepted arc that we're told for the most part, you know?
Yeah, well, I guess if you were to look at the history of whiskey and or spirits in New Zealand, there are three broad phases that I'm going to call. The first one is the ancient history.
Okay.
And that covers everything from 1800s, early 1800s, through to early 1960s, which is a really big era, but again, I'm going to get into that. It was when I was doing the research for this episode and figured out quickly that actually if I wanted to do these topics justice, that there was no way that I could cram all of this into one episode.
Yeah.
So the first one, if we can just call it like ancient spirits history, which goes back to the first European settlement in New Zealand.
Yep.
Through to about the 1950s, and then 1960s through to 2000, which is, I guess, it tried to be the rebirth. They tried to bring it back again, and then the third phase, which we are now in, of this. It's more than just whiskey, because gin has had a massive renaissance. Rum is about to take off. And certainly whiskey as well. There's more variety and more whiskey, New Zealand-made whiskey available in New Zealand than at any other point in time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So three main phases, and this one here, I'm hoping in this episode, which, fair warning, listener, may get a wee bit long, but I'm hoping that you stick with us because I find it fascinating.
All right. So I think we came up with this idea because we've both seen what the history is of the short version that we always get, and it's always people came to New Zealand, they were moonshiners because they were from Scotland, and then that all stopped because the Scottish banks funded the railroad and they told us we had to get rid of distilling, so it was all gone and there was no more distilleries, and then Wilson's was gone, and then that's the history. Right? Yeah. And so and I think we both, looked at this a bit and we thought, what happened when we asked, and what's missing? Because a lot, clearly.
Oh, yeah.
So where do we start?
Okay. Oh, boy. I wrote my honours dissertation in history about the early Otago settlement.
Oh, lovely.
So when I say that this is my house, this is my house.
Right on.
So, Dunedin was founded in 1848, and the idea was that it would be a refuge for Scottish Free Church Presbyterians. So this is the hard point when we say, oh, the Scots came over and they were all shiners, because these are Scots. These are God-fearing Presbyterian Scots mainly from the lowland. And in the first kind of 3 years, by the end of the 1850s, roughly 12,000 Scots have moved over, but they're predominantly from the lowlands.
Okay.
So they don't have that same kind of Highland attitude towards whiskey making, far more conservative. And I would say, I mean, this was a story that I found, was that so the two founders were Captain William Cargill, who was a veteran of the Boer War, and then you also had the Reverend Thomas Burns, who was a nephew of the poet Robbie Burns. And as ships would arrive at Port Chalmers, at the Dunedin harbour, and people getting off, and they would meet them and say, "Are you Scots? Are you Free Kirk? If not, back on the boat." They were very much told, like, no, this is going to be a haven for us here in the New World.
Yeah.
All this changes in 1861.
Okay.
Because 1861, an Australian by the name of Gabriel Reed discovers gold in central Otago, sparking a gold rush.
Yeah.
Globally about this time, the Californian gold rush is starting to wane. And so you've got all of these miners who are looking for the next big thing, and they hear about it in Dunedin. The population, fair to say, explodes.
Yeah.
In a very, very short space of time. And by, what have I written down? 1874, Dunedin is the biggest city in New Zealand.
Really?
Bigger than Auckland by, at this point, by 2,000 people.
Wow.
Nearly 30,000 all up.
That's crazy.
So,
yeah.
1870s, I mean, it's easy to look down on Dunedin now, but this is the point. It has all of the banks are headquartered in Dunedin. All of the money, Dunedin is the financial capital of New Zealand. It's the industrial capital of New Zealand. It has all of the money, the power. The first university is founded in Dunedin, and it all centres around that gold rush. But with that gold rush, of course, comes major influxes of North Americans. There's a Lebanese population, a Chinese population. All of a sudden, it's no longer this free church, God-fearing Presbyterian settlement anymore.
Yeah.
There's a brilliant resource called Papers Past.
Oh, yes. Yep.
net.lib or something. Just Google Papers Past.
Yep.
And they've gone to the trouble of digitizing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers. And you can just use your typical search. You can search for whatever you want, and you can filter by date range, you can filter by location, you can filter all of these things. So I started looking. So as early as the 1830s, especially into the 1840s, Scotch whiskies being imported in regular quantities.
Right.
Because, you know, we've got to feed
drink.
all of these pioneers, and clearly there's nothing available in any kind of regular quantity. Mm-hmm. I'm reading specifically, there's Campbellton whiskey. This is the period of time at which Campbellton whiskey's at its peak.
Yeah.
Lots of Isla whiskey, some Highland, but mainly so they're advertising on shipping manifests and in the newspaper, such and such has got whiskey. 1861, gold is discovered, and there's a shop in Dunedin called Herbert & Co., which sends a letter to its UK suppliers. Whiskey, send the oldest and best of the brand ordered. And at about this time, it's selling 100 gallons of whiskey a week. 1 gallon's 4.5 litres, so this shop's selling 450 litres of whiskey a week.
I think most stores in Christchurch would struggle to hit that collectively in a week today, probably.
But this is one store. So again, Dunedin is your gateway to central Otago, where the gold was, heading into Alexandra, Cromwell, Queenstown, all of those kinds of areas. You get off the boat at Dunedin, you get all of your supplies in Dunedin. When you eventually strike it big, you make your way back into Dunedin because you're taking all of the gold into the banks. So that's really your it was the pipeline. It was where all the money was held. So what does this tell us? It tells us that there probably were moonshiners, but the preference was still for Scotch whisky. Maybe that's the ties there to the old world. They by ordering the very, very best of the brand specified, they clearly wanted to get the people who had come in, were flush with cash, and they wanted to be able to capitalise in on that. And whatever shining industry they had at the time can't have been big enough or reliable enough to be supplying the goldfields or anything like that. At this point in time, it was still very much bring us the Scotch and as much of it as possible.
No, that sounds what you'd expect from a colony. There's probably moonshining, but you're going to get most of it from back home, aren't you? Yeah.
So which then brings us to, and this is kind of where you were looking into, the Distil-Nation Act of 1868, because clearly 1861, all of the people start to arrive, that gold rush starts picking up, and then now all of at this point in time, the government realises either A, we've got a problem, or B, there's stuff that we should be taxing that isn't getting taxed. So in honour of the miners, I thought it, and in fairness, I know the podcast is generously sponsored by the people at Herrick Creek, but I figured it only fair that if we're talking about these early days of shiners, that we have some moonshine.
Well, thank you. My moonshine is probably a little bit of a different style to the one they were making. It would have been barley, I reckon, but this one's corn. So,
yeah, but it would not have been corn.
No, it would definitely not. Yeah.
Tell you that right now.
So here's where I got into the legislation, because I've as I explained with the story that we've been told, the very short version, it goes around the 1860s and 70s. Distilling was shut down in New Zealand, and that the old sort of tale that the Scottish banks funded the railroad. If we shut down, all distillation comes in, and that's where I thought, is that true? And how can there must be a paper trail? I know it's probably somebody paying somebody in their back pocket if that's true, but certainly there would be something that alluded to that, or But what happened is 1868, the Distil-Nation Act is passed, and what it does is it basically lays out the guidelines for what it means to open a distillery legally in New Zealand. And so from this point now, there's punishment, if you will. There's repercussions for illegal distilling. It's not just we distill legally, but there's no rules really, so it doesn't matter. Now it's like, we better be a bit more hush hush about it, I think. And I think that's where people maybe get the idea that distilling was gone, is that people got a bit more careful, and this is just what people do. They probably weren't that careful beforehand, and now they're saying we got to hide this a bit better. We'll just give it to people we trust, and that sort of thing. And
if there are no laws and there are no repercussions, but of course this will. I don't believe that it would have curbed distilling at all. It will have just driven it underground.
Exactly. Yeah. And they laid out a very, a pretty normal process to open a distillery. You had to get a license. You had to get it inspected. You had to have certain equipment standards, a secure premises. You had to have lighting, and you had to have an inspector come in. Spirits had to be stored properly. Like pretty standard stuff, Like just
there are no real surprises in there, from your opinion.
Not in my opinion. Is there any in yours?
No. I mean, they would almost certainly be borrowing from what they know of running distilleries in Scotland and of curbing moonshiners in Scotland.
If I may, the only thing maybe that rings a bell for me is the equipment standards. It says they have to adhere to specified standards for distilling equipment, including minimum capacities for stills, an apparatus capable of exhausting a certain volume of wash per hour. So that was obviously detailed in the legislation how big that had to be, and I don't have that number here.
Right.
But so that might have been maybe a bit of a setback for people who might have been in the backwoods with their 50-liter still. Might have had to be a 200-liter. I don't know what the number is, but suddenly they didn't have a big enough still to go legal with it. So that could put a damper on things, but.
So you've got your moonshine here, which is quite it's very sweet. It's got a sweeter edge. There's certainly more flavour to it than a vodka. And you haven't called yours vodka for a specific reason, right?
Yeah, and it is double pot distilled, as you would a whiskey. It is made from corn and corn sugar. Most distilling is made from some sort of grain and some sort of sugar, you know. I've just decided to go with corn for both of them. And the double pot distill brings it out at about 80% off the still at the end, and it's proofed down to about 50% for really what would be almost a new make whiskey, but it's a little bit cleaner than that. I'd say it's somewhere on the verge of new make whiskey and vodka. In the States, you might classify it as like a light whiskey. You know, that's sort of that middle ground for them. So it's got the characteristics of the corn, but it's still quite neutral-ish, if you will. But that's the point of moonshine. Really was to be drinkable. You know, this is what they wanted. You know, something that they could distill today, drink tomorrow, and as you know, the history of whiskey in general tells you, the addition of oak was kind of an accident. You know, they had to transport it somehow. You transported things in barrels back in the day.
Hide it somehow.
Yeah, hide it. Yeah, and suddenly it came out brown, and you thought, "Damn, that tastes better." So, you know, but yeah, moonshine was still pretty. That was what people wanted. They wanted that clear liquid. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as I was looking through this legislation as well, there are sections to prevent illegal distillation. Mm-hmm. Maybe not prevent, but to prosecute it anyway. That would have been the licensing requirement, the equipment requirement, the duties on these sort of things, the excise duties. Seizures and forfeitures is the big one. Basically, it allowed they could take their stills, the spirits, the ingredients, and anything else in the vicinity. So if you were caught moonshining, there's quite a bit. And it granted powers to customs and police to enter, inspect, and search for unlicensed distillation operations. Basically, an open warrant. You know, if you could just say, we think you're distilling, and they would be able to come in and check everything. So they had quite a bit of power to be able to look for moonshining. Mind you, New Zealand at this stage is probably still pretty spread out and wild. So, you know, it probably wouldn't have been terribly hard to hide one if you wanted to, you know?
No, and that's, I think it's a case of people knew it was happening. Like I said, they hadn't had to hide it before, and if we are talking New Zealand in the 1860s and 1860s onwards, no, it would not have been particularly hard. Much like the Highlands of Scotland, to find a remote valley of some description where you could go and hide. There's nothing unique about that. Here, I guess just to say that it was moved underground. Yeah. We stay in Dunedin because, again, 16 October 1869, New Zealand's first legal distillery, creatively named the New Zealand Distillery, was founded. And again, it's in Dunedin because Dunedin has the people, it has the money, it's still the gateway to the goldfields, and at this point the population is less God-fearing conservative lowland Scots, and there's probably a greater range of expertise in there. So that's 1869, and then 1870 we get the Crown Distillery in Auckland, and these are really the only two legal distilleries that we have in New Zealand at this point in time.
Which would probably make sense, to be fair.
Those are your two population centres, Auckland and Dunedin. And
it's for the population that it had, that's probably, about right.
And I guess...
So is it fair, I'm just going to interject, is it fair that we can put to bed the myth that by the 1860s distilling was dead in New Zealand?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not.
So this is not true at all.
I mean, underground, yes. Moonshining, absolutely. But you only need to look at some of the, 1880, there were 9 breaches of the Distil-Nation Act. They must have gone on a bit of a purge in 1883 because there was 72. And again, these are just telling you about the ones that they caught.
Yeah, yeah.
And for every one that they didn't, there's a handful
Yeah.
that, you know...
and I think for there to be 2 legal distilleries in the 2
Yep.
main population centres, I think that's probably about right for the size of New Zealand at that time. That doesn't mean distilling is dead.
No.
That's right. Like, New Zealand was small. People don't realise that, you know, thousands, not tens of thousands, really. Like, maybe tens of thousands, but certainly not.
Well, if we're saying that Dunedin, and again, we're not talking about the rest of Central Otago and the goldfields.
Yeah.
Just Dunedin, at that point in time, in the 1870s, was New Zealand's biggest city, hands down, at 30,000.
Right, 30,000, right, yeah.
So that's just Dunedin.
Yeah.
So, no, we're not...
Yeah, I think 2 distilleries is pretty fair for that size of population.
So 1873, we get an article in the Guardian newspaper which says that these distilleries are importing peat directly from Islay at the cost of £10 sterling a tonne.
That seems like a lot.
But why?
Yeah, why?
Why?
Yeah.
So during tests, the local peat had been blamed for a difference in flavour between what was being distilled here and imported Scotch. And I'm quoting from the article now. If not, it was felt, it must be the lack of heather in New Zealand peat that accounted for the lack of aromatic flavour in the whisky. So, is it fair to call this a New Zealand whisky when clearly they are trying to recreate Scotch in New Zealand?
Yeah, yeah. But clearly they did use some New Zealand peat and tried it.
They tried it and they thought, oh, but this isn't Scotch.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And we know today, because we do a lot of that now, that, yeah, it is different, for sure. But I wouldn't say it's lacking in flavour. But they would have been thinking, like, oh, we're used to this Islay peat. Bring it over. Come on, we need more of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it's not the same as it is back home. It's not the same as the good stuff.
We've heard that a few times still today.
Yes. So these distilleries start off making whiskey, and I am going to talk derogatively here. They then, once they've got the whiskey production set up, we'll make some gin for the ladies. Was their attitude at the time, and then some brandy. So that was the New Zealand distillery in Dunedin. Up in Auckland at Crown Distillery, they added to that. They were making some rum from imported Australian molasses.
Right. Okay.
So there is a range of things happening.
Yeah.
But I think given our colonial status, New Zealand's not an independent country properly at this time. We're still very much under the thumb of the empire. Whiskey was the spirit of the day, and so whiskey was the focus of what these distilleries were trying to make.
Yeah. Probably gin.
Gin a close second.
Yeah.
So then I found this was really, really interesting. The story starts off, it's a court reporter who gets bored with the case that he's covering and so decides to wander on out and goes to the distillery, the Crown Distillery, that was near the courthouse, walks and asks for the general manager and says, hey, can I have a tour? Now, I encourage you to actually read this whole article. You can find it on Papers Past, and you can find this story in the New Zealand Whisky book by Stuart Perry. So these are the two sources for this. He walks in and says, like, can I have a tour? And this guy drops everything and says, sure can. And this reporter accurately reports what happened. If you want to know about sizes of things and production methods and all of that sort of stuff, he records it in there. And they get to the end of this tour, and the reporter asks, and I'm quoting again, I can see for myself that this excellently arranged distillery turns out large quantities of spirits. Now I should like to know what becomes of it. I have inquired of every wine and spirit merchant in the city of Auckland. I have inquired at every hotel and restaurant keeper, and of numerous private consumers of spirits, and they one and all tell me that they never buy or use, and never will buy or use, colonial distilled spirits, and would not do so on any account whatever. Where, my good friend, do all your manufactures go, and what becomes of them? So this guy, what a dick move. So he's like, okay, you're producing a lot of stuff, but I've asked everyone in Auckland, and nobody wants a bar of it. So where the hell is are your products going? So certainly some attitudes that we might recognise today, and some snobbery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did they say? Because it is kind of a fair question. Who are they producing this for? I mean, at that point, if you're producing in New Zealand, why?
Sure. The poor distillery manager then says to this gentleman, so he made this big accusation, and the distillery manager says, would you like to try some? And the guy says, I would never, sir. Good day to you. And walks out. And he's writing this saying, and look at me for being the guy, because I would never partake in such a thing.
Oh, dear.
So, where did it go? It's, again, there's no legal distillery in Wellington, anywhere south of the Bombay Hills. So, is it a case of people knew that they were being asked a question by a reporter and they're going to say one thing publicly and do another thing privately? Probably.
Yeah.
Are they trying to move this product around outside of Auckland as well? Yep, probably. But at this point in time, and the rules are different today, if you want to call Scotch whisky Scotch today, it's got to be bottled in Scotland.
Okay.
At this point in time, it didn't. And so casks of whisky were being transported over here, and it was a common practice that once here, so you want to ship something over at cask strength, it arrives, you water it down to 40, 43, whatever you have here, and then you bottle it.
Yeah.
A more unscrupulous hotel owner or publican or something like that, in an effort to make their cask of whisky that they've purchased stretch a wee bit further, they might be cutting it with some New Zealand-made spirits. Or maybe they've got that empty bottle of Scotch and they fill it up with something from down the road and they keep that Scotch whisky label on there and they just hope that people can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Interesting.
That's where some of that may well have been going.
I have to say, I really like the voice you put on while you were
Thank
reading
you.
that.
I just wanted to make it clear for listeners that I was quoting from the article.
Yeah.
So that was that article's 1872, bearing in mind that the Crown Distillery only opened in 1870, and the other one's 1869. So these are the only two that have got licenses to act, and they are starting to ramp up production, and everything is going well until it doesn't.
Okay. Dun dun dun.
Dun, bum, bum. I guess this might well be... No, I'll do this first. So, you've got a couple of factors working in here. You've got the prejudice of the New Zealand spirits drinking market. Oh no, I would much prefer Scotch.
Yeah.
You've got those attitudes to contend with. At this point in time also, a very catchy group with the name the New Zealand Alliance for the Abolition of the Liquor Traffic is formed.
Here we go.
And they start... they get a lot of strength and they start heavily petitioning Parliament. What's interesting is that rather than at this point in time taking a blanket prohibition or a blanket kind of temperance stance, their focus is the distilleries.
Okay.
They're like, we can live with beer and wine for the time being, but the hard liquors have to go. So that's what... So yeah, it seems like at this point, when they're talking liquor traffic, it would appear at this point in
They're
time...
talking about liquor.
They're not talking about all alcohol, they're just talking about spirits. So you've got all of these forces in play, and the government passes the Excise Duties Act of 1874, removing protections for locally made spirits. The duty paid on New Zealand whisky is exactly the same as the duty paid on the imported stuff, and without that protection, the local industry crumbled. So basically, this was active government measures to shut down the 2 distilleries that they had granted a license to run.
So this is really the part in the story where distilling in New Zealand ceases.
Yeah, it's at this point. So Mr. R.M. Robertson, so he was a wine and spirits merchant. He's also one of the partners and the shareholders in the New Zealand distillery down in Dunedin. He spoke to the Otago Daily Times in 1874. And shall I do the voice again?
Yeah, go for it. Come on.
From some peculiarity in the water or the malt, we have never been able to make our whisky taste like Scotch. So even at this point, they're not making a New Zealand whisky. They're like, we're trying to make this. So even despite all of this, the distillery itself was solvent, and if the government hadn't intervened, it would have continued. We have succeeded, to a considerable extent, in removing the prejudice which at first existed around a colonially manufactured spirit, which prejudice we hope a few years will entirely remove. So, from his opinion, he's like, we're making good whiskey, even if it's not Scotch. Tough luck.
Yeah.
But we are making good stuff, and we are changing people's perceptions, and basically, mainly,
this is a weird move. This is a really weird move. It is
a really weird move.
Because if you're saying it's being influenced by the anti-spirits people, but we can still import Scotch.
Yep.
Why? You know?
Yeah. So the government paid out compensation.
Yeah.
And the 2 distilleries were converted into breweries and just kind of kept on going.
Yeah.
And to hear this guy in 1874 saying, hey, we're making good stuff, people were very skeptical about the idea of, we're not even talking about New Zealand-made spirit, colonial-made spirit.
Yep.
People were, they didn't like it at first, but we're hoping that we can change people's minds in time. Mm-hmm. This is 18... Now,
sounds like something we hear today.
It sounds like something very much that would have been printed at, like,
yesterday.
2004. So I love that. So that was the end.
Yeah.
No more New Zealand distilleries. Not for lack of trying, because there's one guy, my main man, George Smirl, who applied to the Crown for a distilling license every year from 1929 to 1941. Every year, he sent in his application, and every year it was denied.
Oh.
Basically, the way the legislation was written was basically once a license was granted, it couldn't be revoked unless there had been a breach in the law by the person with the license.
Yeah.
And so he went to court, and he challenged all these rulings, got nowhere, but...
I wonder why he got denied. Oh.
Because the government was actively squashing. So they didn't ban distilleries, they just changed the law to make it more cost effective to import Scotch, removed all trade protection, and then refused to grant new licenses.
So is this then proof that Scottish banks bankrolling New Zealand put this into effect?
So this is okay. Conrad Bollinger is the author here, and he's written a book called Grog's Own Country, which is an objectively fantastic title. Right. Because King Dick Seddon, who was one of New Zealand's first premiers, Richard Seddon, he talked about New Zealand being God's own country.
Yeah.
So it's a quality pun and a play on words that I'm not gonna go past without pointing that one out. So he put the idea that at this point in time, the New Zealand Premier, which is what we had before we had Prime Ministers, Sir Julius Vogel, he needed help. He needed money building a railway project. And so he went over to raise the money in the UK. And now we have to say allegedly here. So allegedly, the backers, the Scottish backers, said, we'll only put up the money if we receive government assurance that there'll be no more whisky made in New Zealand. It's worth mentioning that Stuart Perry, who's written the New Zealand Whisky book, lots of people have looked for proof of this.
Yeah.
Lots of people look for that paper trail and nothing has been found as of yet. He wrote his book in the 1980s. There's a whole lot more in terms of the way of newspapers that have been digitized that we might be able to find. There's more government papers that may well have been declassified from now. So maybe it's out there. I'm not quite sure who's been looking for it yet. So we don't have... It's unlikely to have come from an official document as well.
Yeah.
It's very much the kind of meeting that you would have behind closed doors.
That sounds like a whiskey, a meeting over Scotch whiskey and some
yes.
cigars, yes.
So, and also you talk about the Scottish whisky industry today, and you have the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. You've got organised bodies that regulate these kinds of things, and you didn't have that these days. You didn't have that back then. So...
yeah, your banks were the ones gunning for you. You know, they would have had their hands in those distilleries.
Well, yeah, that's just it. So, no, we don't have proof, but these are loans being taken out by the British financial market, Scottish distilleries, connected to London banks. It's not inconceivable.
All right.
It's not, it very well credibly could have happened. We just kind of need to find that letter or that note made on a
probably
some kind of
thrown
table.
in a fireplace someday.
Yeah.
And we'll never see it. But you know what, I would say then, if this is the myth and you've got most of circumstantial proof really that this is actually this case, and I know I hadn't read this far in this, so before you've just told me right now, I actually thought this was poppycock. I thought this was an absolutely fabricated story. But I think after you've just explained this to me, I think there's
otherwise, why would the New Zealand government shut down two businesses that, if not thriving, were solvent and successful, that they're collecting duty and revenue on?
Yeah.
Why would they stamp them out?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Shut them down, pay the compensation, and then... right through from 1880 until 1969, refuse to approve any distilling licenses.
Yeah.
Now, if I had more time, I would be looking in to say, when did we finally pay off that original loan to get the railways built? And if it was at some point in
the 1960s,
in the late 1950s, early 1960s,
that'd be quite interesting.
There's the
smoking gun,
So at this point, let's bring out Lammermoor.
Yeah, so Lammermoor, down in Lammermoor, in Otago, that good old wood top and cork.
Not that one.
That's not that. Proudly say on their bottles that it was distilled illegally since 1863. Now you've been down there, so
I'm familiar with Central Otago. I haven't been to Lammermoor.
Oh, I thought you had been.
No,
Okay,
it's one I want to get to there.
Yeah.
But yes, so these guys are very much on the way in and out of the goldfields.
Yeah.
And so they talk about the old Cobb and Co. The mail coach going in, and so quite often it would stop by Lammermoor on the way through, take some whiskey in, stop by on the way back. So yes, these guys, John and Suze Elliott, who they are the distillers, but they're also the farmers.
Yeah.
It's predominantly a sheep farm.
Yeah. Huge station, I think. Yeah.
Quite a big high country station. And they were like, hey, they've been looking for one of the original stills that they are sure must still be on the property.
Okay, yeah.
They haven't yet found it.
Yeah.
There is, if you go on YouTube, there is a brilliant country calendar episode.
Yep.
All about them and their station, which also talks about their whiskey and their gin. But I think considering that this one has ties to the goldfields, has ties to everything that we are talking about here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's bang on for what we're talking about, isn't it? And I think their story is quite unique. You know, they are a farm distillery. They grow the barley, they malt their barley, they age it all on site with Central Otago wine barrels.
Yep.
Yeah.
They made a whole lot of the machinery that they used themselves, cobbled together in true Kiwi number 8 wire fashion.
I think their malting machine is an old wool machine of some sort that they've transformed. It's like a big tumbling machine, and it's incredible. So the country calendar episode is a must watch if you want to see all that. They also do make a line of gins, but the whiskey right now is really quite interesting. And I find this is their first release, if anybody wants to know. This is the first edition single malt whiskey, 46%, batch number 001. And I've got bottle number 17.
Wow.
Yeah, I feel pretty proud of that. I get kind of quite a Manuka note on this. And I know it doesn't say it's smoked or anything like this, but I really have always gotten a Manuka note. And because I remember one day you told me, I've got a Manuka one for one of your tastings, I think.
I did get this smoked Manuka.
You got the smoked one.
Yeah.
And you were like, have you tried that one? I was like, oh, yeah, I've got that one. I'm like, it's the first one. And you were like, no, it actually says smoked. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, this is Manuka smoked, I'm sure. But it might not be, but there's something super unique about this whiskey.
I had to talk to a wine friend of mine involved in the wine industry, because I was like, there's something off. There's something off about it. And he said that in aged Pinot barrels, which is what they are using, it's wine country if you're heading through there, so lots of Pinot barrels for them to be using. And in this aged Pinot, it can get an almost mushroom, savoury, forest floor kind of note.
Oh, okay.
And that's kind of... there's a wee bit of chocolate. You get a bit of that red fruit, but for me, there's this, this forest floor vegetation. It's a bit sweet, and maybe that's where you're kind of getting that that Manuka.
It's grassy sweet to me, you know.
Yes.
Like, and I quite like it. I think it's quite unique in that. I wouldn't say there's any smoke to it at all, but there is certainly a sweetness to it for sure. But it's not like a berry fruit. It is more like a honey sweet, you know, to me. So
it's not something. I mean, because I'm not a whiskey expert. I'm not a wine expert by any means. And I think if you had told me that it was come from an ex-Pinot barrel, because it's not bright red fruit, not really kind of tannins going along in there, I'm not sure I'll be able to pick that, but this is certain. Unique is a great word for it. Bit of chocolate, a bit of the.
It reminds me a bit of if you've ever been outside at a winery and they've had the old wine barrels sort of outside that have been sitting in the sun, and you go to smell one of those used barrels that have had Pinot Noir in it. It's not fresh anymore, you know, and it's not rotten or anything, but it's just like hot, dry, used Pinot Noir cask. That's what I kind of get out of it too. If I'm really searching, though.
That makes a whole lot more sense.
Yeah, it's not like fresh, wet barrel Pinot Noir. More like it's set in a field, dried out by the sun. It's a hot day. I can smell it from a distance, kind of thing.
But it's certainly, this has layers and depths.
Oh yeah,
to it.
Yeah, definitely. Beautiful single malt whiskey that's made 100% on their farm. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And if you start talking about, when I heard somebody say like mushroom from a whiskey, and at that point I'm kind of like, oh, get out, and then I smell this and I'm like, oh, yeah, I could kind of. If I say mushroom, is that going to prejudice you enough to try and?
No, I don't get mushroom. And I'll tell you why, because I know the Mark from Elsewhere Gin was in here the other day with his truffle gin, and that was mushroom to me. You know,
okay.
like, yeah, and no, this is definitely like sweeter, grassy, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, more forest floor.
Now, a few years ago, when I was looking at stuff for the distillery, if we come back to sort of this this story we're talking about, this true story, I had looked through the Papers Past, because I love that website. I live on there some days, and I was looking for a certain word, and it must have been moonshine or something like that, and I found it so interesting, some of the results you get for who was caught and when and whatnot. And I was trying to find something relating to Christchurch at that point, and I remember seeing like, oh, somebody on Montreal Street was caught, but they're still in their house, and you know, somebody on Cashel Street this day, and you know, it was like, what is, like, yeah, it's pretty interesting, you know. And this is back, of course, nowadays distilling at home is legal in New Zealand, but back, of course, at this point it wasn't. So,
no, outlawed completely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I see you've got some more on this, especially down in Dunedin.
Yes. So again, we are moving forward. It's really hard to find out information about illicit distilling because illicit distillers don't typically like to promote the fact that they are illicitly distilling.
Yeah.
Defeats the purpose. So you really only get information, as you say, when they're arrested, or if it goes to court, or those kinds of things that either make its way into the papers or make its way into the court record or something along those kinds of lines. But this one, from the Evening Post, because there were so many newspapers back then, so many. This one is from the 10th of June, 1926, and this has the heading of this article: Moonshine Whisky, alleged illicit stills, suspected trade in Otago. Ooh. It's a very long header. And so this article goes in depth here, and it seems like whoever the reporter was managed to get somebody to talk to him anonymously. Mm-hmm. By no mean feat. So I'll quote here from this article again.
In the voice, I hope.
All right, let's go for it. A Dunedin businessman produced a plain bottle of colourless whisky, which he said was moonshine whisky from Southland. He had it tested by an overseas expert who pronounced it mediocre quality grain whisky. It had, according to the expert, been matured for 10 years, a fact that points to large supplies of the spirit being in existence. The sample is a good one as far as moonshine whisky goes, he said, and if blended carefully would mix with other whisky from overseas with satisfactory results. But there are other samples which I have seen that are greatly inferior in quality. Most of the samples are white, but it is easy matter to colour the spirit with burnt sugar, and I believe that some supplies are coloured. It is not altogether the amount of whisky that these illicit distillers sell. I am quite prepared to admit that in comparison with the regular legal sales in hotels, the amount is very small. But it is the injury that these bad whiskies, either pure or blended, may do to the public that has to be considered.
Well done.
So, there's a lot to unpack in there.
Oh, yeah, there is, yeah.
There's a lot. So, okay, he's taken it to an expert,
who
knows, and then this plain bottle of colourless whiskey's been matured for 10 years?
Yeah, come on.
And show me the test which says that you can take a drop of whatever whiskey and it'll tell you how long it's been matured for.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me how you're working that one out.
Yeah.
Who is this guy? Because that's...
I have a feeling, though, it's probably they took it to an expert in Scotch whiskey, and he would have, oh, yes, that's a 10-year-old. Oh, yes, Oh yes, 10-year-old smell. Yes, I think that's all it was.
It
That had to
sounds
be
like
that.
somebody talking utter bollocks in an attempt to kind of sound like they knew what they were talking about. But if you look, I mean, looking at a colourless bottle and then going like, oh, there's some flavour in there. Yeah, oh no, I'd put that at about 10 years. Bollocks.
Yeah, bollocks. Yeah,
Utter bollocks.
Yeah.
And then, okay, but some people who are making shine but want to sell their stuff are adding burnt sugar, mixing it in, and are then trying to pass it off as whiskey. Points for creativity. Well done.
Moonshiners are well known for that. Yeah.
But then, and then we get into this one, and I feel like calling it mediocre grain whiskey. He probably saw as a compliment.
Yeah, probably.
He probably saw that as a compliment. But yeah, why are they making it? What are you doing? You're using it to cut down, to water down the legal stuff that you're buying.
Yeah.
And then kind of ending with this idea that, it's not the fact that the whiskey itself is bad, we just have to worry about bad whiskey, which, given that the entire industry is underground at this point, with no rules and regulations, you've got to hope and trust that whoever you are buying it from does know what they're doing and has kind of got the...
It's very easy to poison yourself when making moonshine if you don't know what you're doing, you know. First of all, even if you have a great still, if you don't take off your 4 shots initially, that's full of methanol, and it's going to absolutely, if nothing, just give you a terrible headache, but that's where your blindness and, you know, terrible sickness comes from and whatnot. But even if you do all that and you make a mediocre still, you know, let's say you make a great still, it's made out of copper, but you use lead solder. Well, great, you're getting lead poisoning now, you know. Okay, but you don't use copper. Maybe you're using some steel, you know, but it's probably just corroding on the inside, so now you're just drinking rust, you know, and like it could be anything. I know people in the States especially were using radiators for a long time as their condensers, and that was full of lead and all sorts of crap, you know, and it was killing people, you know, and so that's where these sort of worries come in with illicit whiskey, of course. So in a colony where I'm sure materials are scarce and you can only imagine what they're making stills out of at this point. And we've seen pictures of them, you know. Some of them look quite nice, but we don't know what they're made out of.
What is that quality like?
Yeah.
So you've got that, and then fast forward another 10 years, and I love this story. Now, for context, some of these excise men, some of the police who have these incredible powers to search and seize, they used an early form of GPS to find these distilleries in the hills.
Okay.
So, you know, if I...
1935.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I, you know, it's basically the equivalent of if I steal your car and then I go through your GPS and go like, okay, find home.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
They would go out and... I'm using the word borrow in inverted commas here, but they would go to the known troublemakers, the known... Because let's face it, these people were notorious, and if we stick down in Otago, there's a lot of talk about the McRae family.
Yes.
And so they would borrow some of their horses, load them up with saddlebags and things like that, slap the horse on the behind, and then follow the horse.
Yes, classic trick. Yes.
And more often than not, that horse would go to where it had been previously led many times, and that was how they found a number of stills. So, but I love this. So this is a case that they have done. Crown Prosecutor Horace McAllister. There's not enough Horaces in the world these days.
Bring it back, people.
So he's trying a case against a pair of McRaes in 1935, and the police have done this trick, found the stills. Basically, has them dead to rights, and the McRaes elected for a trial by jury. And so, and I'm quoting here from now, "The case went well, and I was quite confident of a conviction, but the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty. I was completely taken aback. My father, who was a Crown prosecutor before me at the time, was very ill, and I used to call on him frequently. I went in to see him on my way home, and I told him the outcome of the trial. His reply was, 'Well, you couldn't have expected anything else with a Hielandman for a foreman.'" Now, so just to break that down, a Hielandman, he's talking about a Highlander.
Yeah.
So clearly, either, and I don't know, whether or not this is somebody who's fresh off the boat from the old country, or just somebody who maintained those old Gallic connections to the old world, who is absolutely, if that's the description, somebody that would have gone, "I'm not prosecuting anybody for moonshining. This is their God-given cultural right to..." And I love that the Crown prosecutor has what he sees as a slam dunk, and the jury's like, "Nah, throw it out." Fantastic.
That book, the New Zealand, what's it called? The New Zealand Whiskey book,
Yeah.
of Stuart Perry. It does really paint the McRae family as these legends, doesn't it? Like they really are the legends of New Zealand moonshine.
And it seemed like the McRae family was also quite a through marriage and through procreation was quite a large family as well.
Yeah. If there's any McRaes listening, we'd love to hear from you.
But that was something. So he's writing this book in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And this is a weird side note that we don't really have time to get into, but at one point in time, Southland was dry. Southland was completely dry, and no alcohol at all. And so where we get the Hokanui moonshine is largely from the McRaes that were making moonshine in and around the Hokanui Hills in Southland and Central Otago, smuggling whiskey in and out. And so Stuart Perry's trying to write his book in the 1980s, bearing in mind that through the 1950s and 60s, home distilling was still illegal. He's trying to get people to talk to him for his book, and a lot of people won't.
Right. Okay.
Because they're like, "Are you a lawman? Can I get prosecuted in the 1980s for distilling crimes that I committed in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah.
So I guess my hope would be that if somebody was to do some similar research today and try and find out more, I don't know if there's a statute of limitations, but maybe hopefully people would be a bit more
come out, people, come talk to us. We want to hear about your moonshining stories back in the 1950s and 60s. Yeah.
There's another fabulous book called Scotland's Secret History, written by Charlie MacLean, and I got to talk to him when he came out in March of 2020, and I want it on record that he is a gentleman and a scholar, because they had a book signing at Dramfest, and there was a small queue for have him sign their books. He's written quite a few books over the years, and I had a small pile. All right, I had about 3 books.
Were you that guy?
I was that guy. And so he did the first one, did the second one, World Atlas of Whiskey, I think was, and then he turned that one, Scotland's Secret History, and it's all about the illicit distilling. And he said, nobody's bought me this book to sign at a whiskey event before. It was, in fairness, it was a relatively new book, but equally it was a historical look at illicit distilling, and he had gone through the newspapers and the court records and all of these kinds of things. And I said to him, look, I also have a degree in history, and I know the challenges of trying to get first sources and all of this kinds of thing. And in spite of the line that was behind, we had a chat for 5-7 minutes about that book, and he gave me the time of day. So I think these kinds of stories, there's so much that exists in papers past, and a whole lot of other sources. If we can get people to talk, that, there's so much yet that hasn't been told.
Neat.
So we're coming through to the end. We're
Yeah.
coming through to the end now, and so the last prosecution for illegal distilling in New Zealand was in 1957,
Right.
which
okay.
seems like relatively recent history.
Does it?
I think so. Because when you think moonshiners,
Yeah.
you don't think the 50s.
No, but I almost picture still quite recently, to be totally honest, but not down here necessarily. But yeah, interesting. 1957.
3 years after the repeal of Prohibition, so mainly down in Southland. So what was it? Gerald, the Major Enright of Timpanies near Invercargill, was one of the few moonshiners who continued distilling after Prohibition had ended. He had a huge illegal distribution network that stretched from Invercargill to Christchurch. In 1950, he had been caught and fined and his distilling equipment seized. The police didn't destroy the still, but sold off the components. His mates bought all the equipment and then gave it back to him. So when he was caught again, he wasn't just charged with illegal distilling, but also with seized equipment, and then he was sent to jail.
Oh.
But this goes back to that, complete prohibition in Southland. The whole country didn't go dry, but
No,
Southland
just
was.
Southland, yeah.
And so I definitely know of people who would convert their, I guess, much in the way of the early days of NASCAR with the moonshiners. Here it was less about outrunning the cops and more it was, how can I pack as much booze as possible into this car and hide it so that I can go through a police checkpoint on my way from Otago into Southland and smuggle the whiskey into Invercargill.
Yeah.
Wild.
That is pretty neat, eh? Yeah. It's a rich history.
But you see now why, now that we've been at it for some time, like, so as a preview for the next episode, Wilson Distilling in Dunedin opens up in 1969.
Yeah.
But that's a big jump from the last illegal distiller in 57, where no new licenses have been granted. And still from 57, we've, another 12 years before officially the first legal license is granted.
Yeah. It's a long time.
It is a long time. But that's going to be that next part, looking at the rise of Wilson's distilling and how we get to that. But going from the early days of the Otago settlement right up to now, and it was still very much rise, fall, old prejudice. Like, there are some stories playing out then that are very much kind of recognizable, attitudes that are recognizable from today and conversations that I've had with people in the last 5 years. I love it. I genuinely love this stuff, and if somebody doesn't write this book, I might have to.
I think you are probably the prime candidate at the moment, Cameron. No, I think this is great. I think I after hearing this, because you put a lot more research than I did. I was looking more into the legislation side of it, obviously. The newspapers is such a great angle to hit it from, and I'm excited to see what the rest of it is, and I'm excited to see what else we could find about this in the future and revisit this with, for sure.
Can we find the smoking gun that put Sir Julius Vogel under and it's like, you shut these industries down or you don't get a railway?
Yeah, let's find that, and let's hear what was going on from the moonshiners. There must be some around. There must be some children of moonshiners out there who would probably know some stories. That'd be really cool to hear. And if anybody's interested in more of the stuff, the Gore Museum is sort of the central spot now for all these stories. They run the Hokanui Moonshine operation today, and we don't have any, but we should try it sometime as well.
Try and find some of that. But there are. This could easily have gone on for another hour if I had pulled out more stories from the newspapers and more from the court records.
There's a whole new podcast right here.
Just about the history of this, but it's so...
I'd say if anybody's got any questions that they want to know about this time period that we've just mentioned, or future time periods, because we're not recording that one yet, let us know. Comment, email us, whatever you got.
Whatever you've got. And if you have got some stories, know that we're not going to dob you in to the cops.
Nah.
But yeah, there has got to be, as you have said, now that it's 2024, there have to be kids of moonshiners who can't be held accountable for crimes, who remember modifying a car to do a smuggling run into Invercargill, or who remember their grandpa who was running a still up in the hills in the 1940s or 50s or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
I would love, genuinely would love to know more about this.
Yeah. And let's put a limit on that, 1970, no later than that, really, though. But before 1970, I think that's the interesting period we're interested in.
The proper Kiwi moonshiners.
Yes, yeah. Let's know more. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I think this has been super educational. Thank you, Cameron, for putting in all this effort. I love it. And if you want to know more, if you want to reach out to us at Distil-Nation NZ on all socials, distillationnz@gmail.com or distillation.nz. Thank you for listening, everybody. We hope you'll come again. Cheers.
Cheers.